Hello everyone, I'm Dark Tales and I am here to help you. Today I know you need to this video for a sleep. Before that, like the video and subscribe the Dark Imagine also where you're from and what time you're watching. Now get comfortable and relax. Let's start with first story. It was the summer of 2002 when I first went back to my grandfather's ranch, El Rancho de los Aguilar, in the rural hills of Jalisco. I hadn't been there in almost a decade. My life in Guadalajara was busy, always full of noise and crowds. But something about that summer called me back, something I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the anniversary of my grandfather's death, or maybe I just felt the pull of family. Either way, I drove the long road to the ranch, eager to reconnect with my roots, unaware that my visit would turn into a nightmare. I arrived late in the evening, and the moment I stepped out of the car, the familiar scent of wet earth, pine, and horses filled my lungs. It was both comforting and eerie. The ranch, which had once been full of life, was now eerily quiet. The stables were empty, and the main house, once bustling with family gatherings and the smell of my grandmother's cooking, stood silent as though frozen in time. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments my cousin Miguel answered. He was the only one left in the family who still lived on the ranch, taking care of things after my grandfather's passing. His face seemed a bit more worn than I remembered, but he greeted me with a warm hug. "It's good to see you, Primo," he said, though there was something in his voice that felt off, a slight unease, like he was hiding something. But I didn't press him. After all, we had always been close growing up. We had dinner that evening in the old dining room. The air was thick with the scent of roasting meat, and the sounds of cicadas filled the space between our conversation. But as we ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house, which had once been full of the chatter of my grandparents, now felt abandoned, like an old, forgotten memory. After dinner, Miguel and I sat out on the porch, watching the stars. There was a strange stillness in the air, the kind that makes your skin crawl, as though the world was holding its breath. It wasn't until after midnight that he finally spoke. "You know, there's something strange about this place, cousin," he said, looking out into the darkness. "Ever since Abuelo passed, it's like the ranch is cursed." I chuckled, thinking he was just playing around, but he didn't smile. His eyes were dark, almost haunted. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "There's something out there," he continued, his voice low. "Something in the woods. I've heard it for years. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but then it came closer. I don't know how to explain it, but it's like the land is angry, like something was disturbed when Abuelo passed." I was skeptical. It was probably just his grief talking, but I let it go and told him to get some sleep. That night I stayed in the guest room, which had once belonged to my mother when she was young. The room smelled faintly of lavender and cedarwood, but the air felt thick and heavy, like something was watching. I tried to sleep, but the sounds of the ranch, the creaking of the wooden beams, the rustling of leaves kept me awake. Around 2 a.m., I heard its soft footsteps outside my window. At first I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal. But then the footsteps grew louder, deliberate, as though someone was walking slowly toward the house. I lay in bed, my heart pounding, too afraid to move. The air in the room was freezing, despite it being a warm summer night. Then I heard a whisper, soft at first, then louder. The voice was unintelligible, but there was something familiar about it, like it was calling my name. Terrified, I jumped out of bed and crept to the window, heart racing. But when I looked outside, there was no one there. The night was silent again, too silent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I pulled the curtain closed and stumbled back to the bed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning I told Miguel what I had heard, and to my surprise, he didn't dismiss it. He looked at me with a somber expression, his face pale. "You heard it too?" he asked, almost whispering. "It's the Houston," I repeated, confused. "What do you mean?" Miguel took a deep breath. "It's a spirit. It's been here since before Abuelo, even before we were born. My father used to talk about it. He said it was an old curse on the land, a spirit that feeds on the living, one that comes to collect what was promised to it long ago. I stared at him, not sure if he was joking or not, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He continued. My father said it was a woman, a widow, who had lived on this land hundreds of years ago. She had lost her husband in a tragic accident, and she made a pact with something ancient. She promised to give her soul in exchange for the land's prosperity. And when she died, she became the one who roams the land, taking souls in exchange for the life of the ranch. I felt my heart sink. And you think the spirit is still here? Miguel nodded. I know it is. Every few years it takes someone from the family. First it was my great-grandfather, then my father's brother, and now it's me. I didn't know what to say. I had heard the old stories, the legends of spirits and curses, but I had never really believed them. Yet standing there in the middle of my family's land, I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that something wasn't right. That evening, we decided to visit the old chapel near the ranch. It was a small, abandoned structure built by my ancestors long ago. As we approached the chapel, I felt a coldness in the air, a heaviness that pressed on my chest. The chapel's doors creaked as Miguel pushed them open, revealing a room that had been untouched for decades. The stone altar was covered in dust, and the stained glass windows were cracked, but there was something sacred about it. It felt like the right place to confront whatever was haunting the ranch. As we knelt to pray, the temperature in the chapel dropped. I could see my breath in the cold air, even though it was the height of summer. Then, from the corner of the room, a voice whispered my name. I turned, but no one was there. The whispering grew louder, now accompanied by a soft sobbing sound. I looked at Miguel, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. She's here, he whispered, barely able to breathe. She's come for me. Suddenly, the temperature dropped further, and a figure appeared before us, a woman dressed in a black veil, her face hidden in shadow, her body floating just above the ground. Her sobs filled the chapel, echoing off the walls, her mourning so intense it seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Miguel grabbed my arm. We have to go now? We ran out of the chapel, but as we reached the ranch house, I felt something cold wrap around my chest, pulling me toward the dark woods. I fought against it, but it was too strong, too powerful. And then I saw her standing at the edge of the forest, her face now visible, gaunt and hollow, her eyes dark with sorrow and rage. The tragic twist came too quickly for me to comprehend. In the distance, I saw Miguel collapse to his knees, as if something had drained all the life from him. The use had taken him, just as it had promised. I ran toward him, but when I reached him, he was already gone, his body cold and lifeless. The woman, the spirit, stood behind him, her face twisted into an agonizing grin. She had claimed him. As I stood there helpless, I knew that the curse of El Rancho de los Igualar would continue. It would never stop. The land had claimed its price, and now I too would be its next victim. I fled the ranch that night, unable to look back. I haven't returned since, but I still hear her whispers in my dreams, the Hughes bed, forever wandering, but forever collecting what was promised.